Hey teens, it's great to be back with you. I miss you guys. Can't wait to be able to join with you guys at church again, be able to see you guys here, and looking forward to that next week. But we are going to continue in our study with James. We're going to deal with a passage that is very practical and a simple application, and yet the text itself uh, required a bunch of study for me because of the way it's worded, and it's easy to gloss over some things. But I wanted to really understand what the passage was saying and to be able to communicate it. And it's going to follow up on a part two of what we started last time, a passage teaching on the tongue. So we're going to be in James chapter 3. We're going to pick up in verse 5. And if you remember, verse 1, James gives a warning for teachers that we need to be careful because we're going to be judged by a stricter standard for what we say and what we teach, and therefore we need to make sure that we are teaching the Word of God accurately and correctly. And then he goes on to explain and compare a little bit about what our tongue is like and how powerful it is. And if you remember, he uses two illustrations in the first verse 3, 4, and 5. And he describes it as our tongue is like a bit that is in the horse's mouth, that this little member, yet it controls a lot of power, this powerful beast of a horse. And yet with a bit, you can easily even have a child lead that horse around and control that horse. And then he also talks about a ship, these huge ships, and yet a small rudder can be used to control such a large, powerful vessel. And he says that a tongue is such a small member, and yet it boasts of great things. It has the ability to be able to look and say, "See what I can do." But he goes on in the end of verse 5 then, and he uses another analogy that shows, again, the power of the tongue, but also it's going to go on to show some other characteristics of the tongue. And here in this passage, James gives us two warnings that we need to consider about the tongue. And the first warning that James gives us is really comes from this illustration that he gives. And that is that the tongue is very powerful, and yet it can be very destructive. Not only does he use the analogies that we already talked about, but now in verse 5, he says, "How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire." And think about that. We have a modern equipment and technology to be able to communicate and to be able to transport and to be able to fight forest fires and that type of thing. And yet, a small little spark can set a huge blaze on fire, which can last weeks and months. That it just devastates large amount of areas. This fire, and we understand that fire can be very, very dangerous. And you got to think in their time period, they wouldn't have had the technology or the equipment to be able to fight fire like we did. You have to think that they were in more of an Arab type of environment and a desert type of climate, which means fires would have been able to run rampant if there was dry vegetation in the area. It wouldn't have taken much for it to be able to cause lots of damage. Their houses would have been able to most likely be burnt down very quickly. Even today, houses, as much as we worry about fire, they're not going to survive a fire. They can burn down very quickly. So fire, we understand, is extremely powerful and can be destructive. And James goes on and says, that is our tongue. Verse 6, and the tongue is a fire. And then he's going to go on and describe some of what this fire looks like in our life, that this tongue is. What we say has the potential of doing. It's a world of unrighteousness, he says. The tongue is set among our members. So that's what it looks like in our members. You know, our tongue is a small member of our body, and yet it goes on and it's going to explain what it can do in our life, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life. Okay, it encompasses every aspect of our life, and it is set on fire by hell. This idea that it can lead us to destruction, eternal destruction. It can lead us and can be fueled by this evil that is rampant in our world that comes from hell. And yet, James is saying very clearly here, the tongue can be powerful and destructive, and therefore we need to be careful of it. He goes on and explains a little bit more about this, and he draws another analogy. As destructive as the tongue is, and as far as we have come in advancements in our human, in mankind, and in our technology, and in ability to be able to do things. Verse 7, he says, "For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and the sea creature, can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind." And then he goes on and says, "But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison." And James is just running on this analogy that it is dangerous. What we say and our tongue is so powerful and so destructive that it is very dangerous. And even though mankind has given the directive at creation to go out and rule and subdue the earth and to have dominion over these different types of animals, we've been able to control and domesticate a lot of different animals. And at the same time, even though we're able to do that, he says, but no man can tame the tongue. And what James is saying is we cannot completely contain and control the tongue because it is that dangerous. He goes on and says that it is a restless evil full of deadly poison. So James very clearly here lays out and describes that our tongue is powerful and can be destructive. And some of the terms he used in verses 6 and 7 and even in 8 there we can kind of read through them and we get the gist of it really quickly. But some of those terms are a little harder, and actually the verse 6 is a very hard verse to be able to understand in the Greek, and lots of commentators and scholars have spent many long hours trying to figure out verse 6. But I want to try to help explain what I've been able to learn as I've been studying it. So the tongue is a set apart of our members. That's the idea that it's a part of our body, and that it can affect many different areas of our body, many different areas of our life. And it goes on and explains that in the rest of the verse then. It's a world of unrighteousness. Again, looking and kind of thinking back to even what Jesus taught. Our tongue can be what is viewed as unrighteous, unclean, unholy for us. In Matthew 15, Jesus is going to be arguing with some of the Pharisees and some of the people there who are upset that the disciples ate food with dirty hands, and they hadn't cleaned their hands, and therefore they defiled their bodies. And the religious leaders were attacking Jesus at this. And Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 15 verses 10 11. He says, "And he called the people to him and said to him, Hear and understand, and it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person." And what he's saying is it doesn't matter what we eat, okay, and if our hands are dirty, that doesn't defile us. But what comes out of our mouth, our words and our actions, are going to show that we are unrighteous, that we're or that we're defiled. In verse 18, he goes on with this idea then, and he says, "But what comes out of the mouth is proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, idolatry, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defiles a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." And Jesus there is very clearly teaching is not about the rituals and being careful that we follow a set of rules as far as what we eat and how we do so. But Jesus and James is going to follow it up here with the same idea. It's not about that set of rules. It's really about how we live our life, what we say, what our heart is like, what our actions are. And that's what James is arguing for throughout this whole book, that we live out our Christianity and we don't just talk it. But here James is saying, our tongue, it can be a world of unrighteousness. It can show that we are defiled and unrighteous by what we say. So it's important for us to control what we say because it shows the condition of our heart. He goes on in verse 6 there and says that it sets on fire the entire course of life, and it is set on fire by hell. And that's the idea that it can be a part of every aspect of our life, and it can have devastating impact on all of our life. And therefore, we need to be careful of our tongue. Just like a fire easily spreads in it, it rapidly consumes, and it is very destructive. The same thing is true for our tongue. And then he goes on, of course, and says in verse 7 there about taming all these different types of creatures. And mankind has done that, we can see, but has also been given the directive to do that in the creation story, that we are to rule over these animals and over the creation God has given us. But verse 8 there, but no man can tame the tongue. And I really struggled with this verse because um, I don't believe James is saying that we shouldn't control our tongue, and that we shouldn't work towards it, and that we can't have victory in this area. And yet James very clearly here says we cannot perfectly contain the tongue, because it is a restless evil. Going back to chapter 1 verse 8, that word there used for restless evil is the same word as the unstable person. And so James is saying there that the unstable man, needs wisdom. There's restless evil that comes from our mouth. We need to have wisdom. We need God's help to be able to do this. It's full of deadly poison. It's very dangerous. The idea there is of a snake, a venomous snake, a creature with poison, and yet that can be our tongue. And how true, like little words, little comments that we say to one another. It's easy to write it off and say, well, I was joking, or I just said that, I didn't really mean it. And yet those little words can carry a lot of devastation with them, just like poison. It doesn't take a lot of poison to mess up your life, to kill you, really. And yet at the same time, what we say, no matter how small, can have devastating impact. And James here is saying that none of us can perfectly contain the tongue. That's impossible. But this should not lead us to abandon all efforts to bring our speech under control. Of course not. The realization that perfection is something that is unattainable should not dampen in the least bit our enthusiasm to become as good as we can at controlling our speech. We may never reach the point where the tongue is perfectly controlled, but we can surely advance a long way in using our speech to glorify God. That was a quote I read in one of the commentators that I read, and it really does sum up what James is saying here. He's not saying abandon hope because we can't control this, but realize the danger and power of it, and the fact that each and every day we need to be striving to control what we say. So James very clearly here gives us this first warning that we have, that the tongue is powerful and it is very destructive. It can be very dangerous. And therefore we need to work at controlling it, at being the mature individual who is able to bridle their tongue. We're not going to do it perfectly, but hopefully each and every day we can become more and more like Christ, and we can have more and more victory in this area of controlling our tongue and using it for God's glory and not for the destruction of those around us. Well, James is going to give us a second warning in this passage also. He says that the tongue can be used for good or bad. In verses 9 through 12, he clearly lays this out. Verse 9, it says, but with it, referring to the tongue again, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. For with the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brother, these things ought not to be so. And then he asks these questions to kind of help us think through this and say, okay, yes, we can use our mouth to bless God and then turn it around and have arguments with other individuals. We can curse other individuals. We can belittle them and tear them down. We can call them names. We can ridicule them, all those things. And yet all we're doing is turning around and tearing down and cursing a individual who is made in the image of God. And so often, unfortunately, that tends to be characteristic in our life. That there are times where we talk really good and we bless God and we praise Him and we try to edify Him, and then we turn around, we leave church and we go home and we blow up at our parents and we ridicule and tear down our siblings. And James is saying that ought not to be a part of our life. And he goes and he asks these questions to help make it click in our minds to say, this is not natural. This is not how things work, and it should not be the case in a Christian's life. Verse 11, he says, does a spring pour forth or bring forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Well, it's a rhetorical question. Of course not. Okay, a spring can only be fresh water or only salt water. It can't be both. Okay, he goes on in 12. Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grape produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Okay, we understand that a corn stalk produces corn, and a tomato plant produces tomatoes, and a walnut tree produces walnuts. It doesn't produce other things. An apple tree produces apples. It doesn't produce bananas. Okay, we understand that. And James is saying, if we look around in creation, we realize that this is not natural. So why do we allow it in our life as Christians to say we are going to, on Sundays, when we're at church, when we're trying to get TNT points, when we're trying to please a teacher or a pastor or our parents, we can turn around and bless God and use our tongue to edify one another and build one another up, and we sound really good, but then we turn around and we tear down God's creation, the individuals who are made in the image of God. We shouldn't do that as Christians. And James is very clearly pointing out here, our tongue can be used for good or for evil. Pastor Tony just did a message this week on it, or a devotional on Facebook, talking about this very verse, that we have the option, we have the choice to say, are we going to use our words to bless God? Are we going to tear down individuals in His image? Are we going to use it for good, or are we going to use it for evil? Jesus deals with this in Matthew chapter 12, kind of going on with some of the other things that we already talked about. But he talks to this aspect that it's from our heart, and that we can't live both ways. We can't pretend to have good words and then turn around and use bad words. We can't pretend to be righteous and holy before God, walking with Him and being in a good relationship with Him, and then turn around and use our speech and curse Him and use swear words and be angry at individuals and tear one another down. He says it can't be so. Matthew chapter 22, verse 33 through 37 says, either make the tree good. He's arguing with the Pharisees again. He says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For a tree is known by its fruit. He says, you brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. James is saying we can't have it both ways. If we're going to call ourselves a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, and we are going to strive for a relationship that is right with Him, then we need to control what we say. And it's hard, but we need to put in the effort to do it. It's easy in life when things are going well, when school's going well and you have good grades and your sports team is winning and things are going well at home, and you're looking forward to the vacations that are coming up. It's easy to put on a show and to hide what is in your heart. But when you smash your thumb with a hammer, or you stub your toe in the middle of the night on the nightstand or on the chair as you try to get a drink from the kitchen, okay, when When you're in a game and an opponent flagrantly fouls you, when you overhear your friends tear you down in front of others, or you're convinced that another player, is a noob and they're using a cheat or a hack, what comes out of your heart then? When those instances where we just respond and there's no filter on what we say, what does it show as the condition of our heart? Jesus makes it very clear. What we say is going to show the condition of our heart, the state of our heart. And if our heart is unrighteous, if our heart is not in fellowship with God, it's not in a relationship with Him, and it's dwelling on things that aren't pleasing to Him, then eventually what we say is going to be displeasing to Him. There's a reason why what we say is important. There's a reason why we like doing sports here at church, and why sports can be such a good show of character, because in the heat and the pressure of life, when things don't go as you planned, especially when they're like on the spur of the moment and you had no warning of it, that instant shows what your heart is like, how you respond. Do you throw the controller? Do you scream at the computer or the Xbox or the PlayStation because these guys got to be cheating and it's unfair? Do you get mad at the other opponent or the ref because of the call that was made or wasn't made? Do you curse and swear when you stub your toe or you smash your finger? It's a natural response. And yet James is saying it cannot be the response of Christians. It's showing that our heart is not in fellowship with God, and we need to work on our righteousness. We need to work on our holiness before God. What we say is important, and we see that from this passage. So this week, what are we going to do? What are we going to choose to say? Are we going to use our words for good or for bad? You see, we see our words are powerful, that they can be destructive. We see that we will be judged on everything that we say. And therefore, even if controlling our speech is hard, and we will never be perfect in controlling our speech, we need to strive to control our speech more and more every day. You might have heard the little saying that kids say sometimes, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. James is actually saying the exact opposite in this passage. The reverse of the truth of this is really what comes out. Far easier is it to heal the wounds of sticks and stones, the breaks, the wounds that you have, the I'm gonna I'm gonna resort to kids' wordage here, boo boos that you have, the black and blues, those heal, but words that we say, they cause a whole lot more damage. Gossip, lying, just untrue speech, unkind speech, it really can be devastating. And it can affect every aspect of our life. And James is saying we need to strive as Christians to become more and more like Christ and to have control over what we say. So this week, are you going to use your speech for good or for bad? I encourage you, strive to use it for good. And when you fail, get back up and try again. It's not easy and it's not going to go away. And it's something we need to do each and every day. And yet, as a mature believer, it can be a characteristic of our life that we have self-control over what we say. I'll be praying for you, and until next time, take care.